You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, rigorously researched history that brings the American mob to life, one true story at a time. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Stoops, mob historian, and we've got a good one today. We're going to be having a conversation about the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello, and I am joined by an expert on Frank Costello, Ron K. Freed, the author of Frank Costello, a Novel. Welcome into the show, Ron.
Thanks, Jacob. Thank you.
So, Ron, I've read your book, but I don't remember the actual release date. When did it come out?
December of 2022.
Okay, so it's in terms of this genre, it's still pretty fresh.
Yeah.
But I want to jump right at, I want to cover the book because it's an interesting take on Frank Costello, and it really dives into a very specific a time frame with Costello. It bounces around to his early life and some later, but it really focuses on one particular area. Then I want to talk about the real man, and then I want to get your thoughts, of course, on the movie Alto Nights, which just came out.
As one of the five people in America who has seen it, yeah.
Right, exactly. Well, it's not exactly doing so well. It's been critically panned by just about everybody, and that seems to be. It just seems to be the way the mob genre is going. Almost every movie that comes out about the mob genre lately has just been bad, not just bad, but very bad.
Well,
for one reason or another.
It's got some tough competition, right? It gets compared to these classic films.
Yeah. It does. It's a high standard that has been set.
Yep.
So let's jump into the novel. So what inspired you? So this is different. It's not a biography of Frank Costello. It's historical fiction.
Yep.
What inspired you to kind of take the historical fiction route?
Well, I worked on a TV show called The Making of the Mob New York, which was on
great.
AMC.
That was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So I was hired as a writer on it. I don't think 7 words I wrote actually made it to air. And then I ended up doing it was a docudrama, so it was a combination of voiceover narration, dramatic recreations, and interview bites with talking heads. And I ended up doing the talking heads interviewed, which was really interesting and fun. And so what I became most interested in with Costello's life was why he, unlike his compatriots in the mob, testified in the Keefe overhearings. Like what drew him to do that? What sort of, it was a terrible miscalculation on his part because it resulted in his going to jail and to a very public humiliation. And it wasn't and it was a public humiliation because the interview was televised, and this is a brand new medium. It was television. And I don't think that he or any of the congressmen who were interrogating him quite understood the power of this new medium. So even though most people didn't have TV sets in those days, the Kefauver hearings were shown in movie theaters, and people would rather see the the hearings than to watch the feature film, because it was a revelation to the vast majority of Americans just how powerful the American mafia had become, for a number of reasons, including the fact that J. Edgar Hoover really hadn't investigated or acknowledged the existence of organized crime. So most of the people that Costello worked with took the fifth or gave very, very concise non-answers. But Costello lived in two worlds, right? So he lived in he was the acting head of the Genovese crime family, and he had vast power in Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic Party in New York City, which was the dominant party in New York City. So he could name judges, he could veto judges. He had, congressmen and assemblymen and city officials basically answering to him to some extent. And so he hobnobbed with these folks, and he thought, well, I'm one of them. And that was, a terrible, naive mistake. And that's what interested me. Why would this seemingly powerful man, so-called prime minister of the underworld, make this huge miscalculation, this sort of naive misunderstanding of who actually held real power in America? It wasn't like Luciano, it wasn't Frank Costello, it wasn't the mafia, it was the United States government, and it was the American public. And to me, it seemed like a poignant story in a way, and it seemed like an immigrant story. So I saw Costello as a very powerful yet naive immigrant who didn't quite understand how this country worked, and he got wised up in a very public, humiliating way. So towards the end of the Kefauver hearings, his testimony after I think it was before he walked out, he came back. But the sort of most dramatic moment, and the reason that the point that I wanted to get to in the book, is a moment where the sort of very self-righteous congressman from somewhere in New England says, "What have you done for your country, Mr. Kefauver?" Says, "What have you done for your country, Mr. Costello?" And Costello, in his incredible sort of New York accent, says, "I paid my tax."
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they? Paid my tax.
And he was laughed at. So here you have the head of the Genovese crime family being laughed at in public, and everybody in America can see it. So I thought, well, that's a good story. I can write that story.
And I believe that senator's name, if I'm remembering right, was Charles Tobey.
Senator Tobey, indeed, you're correct.
Yeah, I think
Very good.
I think that was the one, and I don't think anybody really liked. I've heard that guy described by other people. I don't think anybody actually really liked that guy, but man, did he understand how to grill people when he was, sitting up there in those hearings, and he really took it to Costello. And reading your book, which, as I remember it, it's historical fiction, but all of the words that were used in terms of the quotes were real and based on real things that they said.
Right.
And what I liked about your book was that I felt like it put you right in the room, right in the hearing, right in the room, to feel what it was like, to feel that pressure, almost to feel like, you're sitting in the chair as Costello, with probably the sweat trickling down your forehead as you're sitting under this immense spotlight. And I think you even described the room as because it was a much smaller room than
Yeah.
what you see on TV as incredibly hot.
Yes. Well,
Um,
in those days,
yeah,
TV lights were brutal. Brutal. And if you look
yeah,
at sort of wide shots from the press accounts, it was packed with people. I don't even know, like, how did they all get in there? And the pressure is on him. So essentially, he's on trial, but he's not on trial. But he's sworn
yeah,
in, and I think it was the second, but it was the first major congressional hearing to be put on television. So.
yeah,
If you're not young enough, but the Watergate hearings are a very big deal. This was the first very big deal.
yeah. And he was the star. Uh, so I'll ask you another question. So the
Okay.
way you approached it, I think it made your job more difficult because it wasn't a straight biography. As an author, how do you feel like you were able to capture his personality and what he might have been like, and where do you feel like maybe you took some creative liberty?
Well, one of the reasons that everything that he says in public, he actually gave interviews where he would try to come across as a legitimate person. He would talk to the press. He testified in court when he's a young man because he kept getting in trouble, and so the court testimony is available. He was accused of being a drug kingpin, of being in charge of importing heroin into the United States, which he claimed he had no involvement with that. And so he had a press conference, and I had a transcript of the press conference. It was an astonishing thing for, a gangster to do, and always a disastrous thing to do. Al Capone actually used to talk to the press in Chicago, where there would be a hit of someone that he had obviously ordered, and he'd go talk to the press and said, I have nothing to do with it. So one of the fatal flaws of these guys sometimes is that they like attention. You can see it with John Gotti. He liked attention. And the most successful, the most enduring mob leaders, the ones who are never talked to the press or never seen. So, and I thought it was important to stick to the historical record, the public record at least, throughout, because I just find that if you read a lot of books about mob history, which I've done, stuff that isn't true gets repeated from one book to another book to a website to another book to another book. And a
Yep.
lot of them have been disproved by anyone who bothers to do real scholarship about it. So I didn't want to repeat any of those ideas. And I didn't want to repeat this idea that these guys are they're playing four-dimensional chess, that they're masters of the universe, that they're these great strategists. Because if you look at their careers, they make terrible mistakes, and they almost inevitably end up in jail, with very few exceptions. And Costello himself made a terrible blunder, and he ended up, going to jail. So, but what I thought I could do is make the public part of it adhere to the record, and then I would imagine what his inner life was like. And I kind of
Yeah.
thought that I could do that for a number of reasons. I mean, that's sort of the job of novelists. But for one thing, I'm from New York, and I had written a nonfiction book about old-time boxing trainers. And these were guys who grew up literally on the same streets that Frank Costello did. And I spent a lot of time talking to them. So I sort of knew how they sounded. I had a grandfather who grew up in Brooklyn, and his New York accent was a lot like Frank Costello's accent. Costello grew up in East Harlem. But they sounded alike. They would say goyles rather than girls, things like that. So it all felt very
Yeah.
familiar to me. And then I have a very dear friend who's a criminal defense lawyer. And so I have on occasion had dinner with some of his clients, and he's represented a lot of organized crime figures. So I felt that I had an understanding of how they viewed the world to some extent. And I noticed that one of the conceits that allows them to do what they do is this notion that everybody's a crook, right? And that we're no worse than anybody else. So I thought that would be, and they had a certain resentment of straight people. So I thought I had license, as it were, to imagine what Costello's inner life was like, and then, what he might say to his fellow gangsters. And of course, there were wiretaps I could look at, so I kind of knew how these people talked to each other. There are a lot of wiretaps between Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel talking to each other. So you get these two Lower East Side guys talking to each other in sort of this very cryptic, very New York way. So I felt as though I could get the voice right. And then the other thing is that I thought, like, my inclination was I'll just narrate it from the point of view of a friend of his or a lawyer. And I thought, well, why don't I just write about the monster himself, just like go into his brain, because that hadn't been done. So I took a shot at it.
I thought it was pretty compelling.
Thank you.
You really did, again, make, when you're reading a biography or you're reading the history, a lot of times it's facts, it's names, it's dates, it's things that happened, and sometimes it's hard to try to put yourself in their shoes and feel like what it must have felt like, or what were they really like. And I felt like you did a good job of that. What comes through also is the relationship that Costello had, not just with his wife, but his girlfriend.
His girlfriend, yes.
And
yes.
Yeah,
I
a
love
certain
that. I love
amount
that.
of.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying I love this setup. He had he lived on Central Park West, on the west side of Central Park, and 18th floor apartment overlooking the park. And he set up his girlfriend right across the park on Fifth Avenue, so he could just stroll over there in the afternoon, spend some time with her, and then head home to his very patient wife. But
they
it
both
was
knew,
in its
they
way.
both knew the deal too.
They did, yes. But in a way, it was typical of him because it was very discreet. It was how some rich guy on Fifth Avenue would do it. You don't see him racing around town with his girlfriend or multiple girlfriends. It's all sort of set up very discreetly. And so I thought that was indicative of his personality. Her name was Thelma Martin.
Yeah, and there, it was also indicative of the time period too, because you definitely had the, trying to think of the right word for it, the masculine versus the feminine. The man does everything. The breadwinner, who cares what a woman. It's very early 1950s man and woman dynamic, and that definitely came through. Which in this day and age, to be able to put that on paper is not always easy. But it, probably truly was the way that it was like.
Yeah, I felt that he would be casually racist about African Americans because that's what people were like then. And that he would see people in ethnic terms. So Jews are like this, African Americans are like this, Catholics are like this, because that's the mentality I got, particularly from talking to those old time boxing trainers. And I thought that, he would be, by today's standards, sexist, just utterly sexist.
And it came through. But it was normal at that time. Yeah, it was normalized, so it probably didn't seem wrong to him.
Right, so I didn't know much about his wife. I knew that she was Jewish, which was interesting to me, because they were both outsiders. They weren't members of the WASP establishment. And in the end, that's a sort of extremely WASP senator from New England who sort of is the chief architect, one of the chief architects of his undoing. And I thought, well, that's interesting. They married this Jewish woman, but I had no idea what the relationship was really like. So I thought it would be funny if every piece of advice that she gives him in the novel turns out to be correct. Like he's going to say, I'm going to have a press conference. She says, don't have the press conference. It'll backfire. She's right. He's going to testify. She says, don't testify. He testifies anyway, et cetera, et cetera. So I just thought it would be funny if everything that she said was correct. And which is entirely possible. And that he would never listen to her, no matter what.
Yep. So let's get into we've been talking about the real guy, but from a book perspective, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how you portrayed him. Let's talk about the real historical Frank Costello. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of who he ultimately became was really shaped by his early life and his upbringing, and some of the disdain that he had for his upbringing as well as some of his experiences. So for those that may not be as familiar with Costello, can you talk a little bit about his early life and how that ultimately shapes him to become what he becomes?
Right. So he was born in Calabria. He's not Sicilian. People think there were only Sicilians in the original mafia. That's not true.
Yeah. And that's a problem at that time. A little.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, he did all right, right? So it's not like
He did all right.
he wasn't an outsider. And he so his family, his father was did manual work. He came to the United States. He was working in Westchester on, basically, real, basically working with a pickaxe and a sledgehammer. And as many Italian American immigrants did when they first came to this country. So he came here. He had an uncertain command of English, if any, and so I think he dropped out of school in maybe the 4th or 5th grade, and that must have been a humiliating experience for him. He's a very intelligent guy, obviously, but he couldn't really understand what was going on in a lot of the classrooms. So that was a negative experience for him. So he essentially grew up on the streets. It's sort of the cliche is that the only people East Harlem. You have to understand that East Harlem was Italian American in those days. So there's still an Italian American enclave on Pleasant Avenue. That's where the sort of famous restaurant Rayo's still is. That's one of the last, and that's where Fat Tony Salerno had his clubhouse around the corner.
He stayed in Harlem his whole career.
His clubhouse stayed in Harlem. I think he had a place in Westchester.
And also he spent some time in Miami too.
Yeah. So and that's also actually nicely portrayed in The Irishman. They go up to and there was actually a shot of the actual Fat Tony's
Palma Boys.
Right. His clubhouse, which is like now a condo or something. And the Ravenite, by the way, the Ravenite social club in Little Italy is now a boutique.
I've heard that.
It's sort of amazing to walk by there.
Probably got ghosts walking around that place.
Or a few federal bugs still in the walls
still there
somewhere, listening to people, buy their $800 shirts or whatever. So he grew up on the streets, and sort of the cliche, which I think is probably somewhat true, is that the respected people were the criminals. They were the wealthiest people in that area. And but he kept, he got arrested. He got arrested 3 or 4 times. He had a way of talking his way out of it. And one of the things that interested me about reading about his early life is he always lied. And if you look at his whole life, he lied in court. He lied in his naturalization papers. He lied on his marriage certificates, lies. And he lied to himself, and he lied to the press about who he was. So there's this whole series of lies, which begins in his childhood. You see him, he's in court, and he's lying to the judge. And then all those lies get exposed in the Kiefover hearings in public, So that had the quality of nightmare. And I thought, well, that would be great to write about, because everybody has sort of their worst case scenarios, but to see it played out in public, to see him, this powerful man, being humiliated was, I thought, a really good story. But to get back to your question, so he kept getting arrested until, like the police would catch him with a gun, and he'd run away from the cops and throw the gun in, a vacant lot, and they'd pick up the gun. And that's what finally got him into trouble. And he got a year in Welfare Island, which was there was no Rikers in those days. It was Welfare Island, which is just it's on the East River near the 59th Street Bridge. And spent a year there. And he always said, when I came out, I vowed never to use a gun again, or never to carry a gun again. I doubt that that's true, but I think broadly speaking, it is true. I could find no record of him personally using a gun. for any to commit any crime after that. And then what really happened was what happened to a lot of these guys was Prohibition. That what Prohibition did was it took petty criminals and it gave them like the biggest opportunity of their lives and it was a terrible piece of legislation. It's a terrible piece of legislation because it made illegal something that a lot of Americans wanted, particularly in big cities, right? Most Americans wanted. Mm-hmm. So it became illegal to get a beer. So, why is that bad? Well, A, because you can't get a beer, but B, because it turns ordinary citizens into lawbreakers, right? Because they're going to go to the speakeasy and get the beer. It corrupts policemen. They don't want to enforce this law. And all of a sudden it takes these petty criminals and makes them amazingly wealthy. And they can use that money to pay off and corrupt the policemen. And the corruption of the policemen breeds cynicism in the public. So other than that, it was a fantastically successful piece of legislation. And what it did was it gave enormous wealth and power to the bootleggers who were Costello was incredibly well organized and, showed his sort of mastery of how to set up an international business really. And very impressively. And, he had, but it made him really rich. And so then what happened is he used that money to corrupt Tammany Hall. Right, because they needed money, because there'd been a lot of reform in New York City, so traditional methods of paying off politicians somewhat disappeared, and Costello filled the void when the reforming politicians like LaGuardia and then Dewey came in. That's what happened. So, but if you really look at what he did, and during Prohibition, it's incredibly impressive. He had an office, which is where the Chrysler Building is now, and they had airplanes surveying where the Coast Guard was, and they had people who were basically in charge of bribing Coast Guard people, and they would hang out in the same bars that they hung out in. But the bribes also sort of worked their way up the echelon of the Coast Guard. So a lot of people were on the take. And he organized it all, and he was getting shipments from Europe at this island off the coast of Canada. And then he had speedboats that could outrun the Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera. And it was extremely sophisticated, very successful. And they had to get the booze in from Long Island into Manhattan. And they had a system of paying off the cops along the way. So there was no Long Island Expressway. So it was like this police department, that police department, that police room. So they had to corrupt all the cops along the way. And they did it. And so even if they stopped the deliveries, there was a certain code word. They knew that they would get paid off the next day if they let the deliveries proceed. And the deliveries proceeded into the city, where at times the New York City policemen would help them offload booze into their storage facilities. So, it was, it was a piece of legislation that just spread corruption.
And the interesting thing is, I always like to say the Prohibition, without it, the mob never becomes what they became.
Absolutely.
Because it gave them the resources to go from being the low man on the totem pole, the lowest of society.
Yeah.
Whereas the politicians and the police were above them in the pecking order. Other ethnicities were above them in the pecking order, and they flipped it on its head, more or less. Yeah. And the underworld became the upper world, and then they had the power over everything and everybody. Costello, in particular, like you said, he owned an entire fleet of ships that did everything that you just said. And I always say, in addition to giving them money and power, this experience with Prohibition gave a lot of those early leaders a PhD in running a multinational, highly complex, multifaceted organization. And they would not have gotten that experience without Prohibition coming along and forcing them, because of the enormous sums of money that were involved, to learn how to run a business when many
Right.
of them didn't even get out of grade school.
So
So it's pretty crazy.
and it was natural to take that expertise that you just described and use it to bring
Yeah,
drugs into the country. So,
yeah,
which was, much more insidious, and that ruined so many lives,
yeah,
and they were profiting off of it. Yeah.
yeah. And that's one of the biggest fallacies. Gosh, I feel like I hear a lot of people, especially guys that were in the life that are now out of the life. They don't deny it. Like all the families, whether they had the edict or no edict, they were all drug dealers, all of them. The
Yes.
the biggest drug dealer in the United States over the course of the 20th century was the American mafia, and it's not even close. And most of these guys, despite the public facing sentiment, guys like Luciano was a drug dealer
As a
coming
kid.
up as a kid,
Yeah.
right? And so these are the
Well,
guys that formed the whole thing, and they're all drug dealers.
and Arnold Rothstein, who was who gave the seed money to Costello to start during Prohibition, was the biggest heroin importer
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yep.
Yeah.
Prohibition happens,
Hmm.
and Costello's building wealth and building power. Eventually, he meets Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, right? Vito Genovese, who would be especially important in a bad way in his life. Benny Siegel, and who knows who else? All the big players Costello met through Prohibition and bootlegging, and knew and made connections with, not just in the underworld, but politicians. That's when he starts making the connections with politicians. That's also when he kind of becomes a member of the mafia, right? Because in New York at the time, there were different families beginning to emerge. And of course, the guys that he knew were at that time part of what was the Masseria Morello family.
Right.
And then, of course, as history will show us, the Castellammarese War happens in about 1930, 1931, with Masseria going against the Maranzano organization. They're battling it out for supremacy, not just in New York, but all over the country. And they both lose. Masseria is killed, then Maranzano, and Luciano steps up and becomes the boss of bosses, not in name because he did not want to take that role, but he was essentially the first among equals. And they set up the national syndicate, which was already kind of in place. A lot of people think that Luciano made the rules about the structure of the family. He didn't. That was Maranzano, but he was the one that put it together and made it happen and added the commission and made that work and made that function. And you have Costello and Genovese and all of these guys right there behind him as the guys kind of behind the scenes that more than likely helped him architect that. And
Yes.
so I want to jump ahead. In the mid 30s, and I've done an episode on this, a murder happens, a murder to a guy named Ferdinand the Shadow Baccia. And I like to call this murder because Baccia he was nobody, essentially. He was just a low-level guy. But the person involved in this murder was Vito Genovese and Mike Miranda. They're the ones that set it up. And it was probably a murder that did not need to be committed because Genovese, by that point in time, was the acting boss of the family because Luciano had been convicted of compulsory prostitution, and he goes away. And Genovese steps in. Costello's not the boss yet at this point. He's
Right.
in the upper echelon, but he's not the boss. It's Genovese. And Genovese gets swept up in this murder and authorizes it because I think he got greedy and he was bloodthirsty.
It was
And
it was a gambling debt, right? They had there's some sort of
yeah,
corrupt card game, and he was going to split it with this guy Baccia, and he didn't want to split it, so we thought he'd just kill him, as one
he just
does.
killed him. He just killed him. And
Yeah.
well, this murder comes back to haunt him. And I always
Yeah.
say without this murder, this is the most significantly unsignificant murder in the history of the mafia. Because without this murder, Genovese never goes to Italy, and Costello never steps up probably and becomes the boss. Now, who knows what would have happened with Genovese had he stayed in that boss position? But let's just play it out. Genovese goes to Italy, and then he's there for more than 10 years. And when he comes back, Costello's the guy in power. Costello's the boss. And Genovese doesn't like that. And from that point on, those two men are at odds, and Genovese is constantly undercutting Costello, slowly but surely grinding away at him.
Right.
And that's really the point at which your book starts. And you don't get a ton of the Genovese interaction, but he's there. He's slowly chipping away at Costello's authority, and then eventually they make the attempt in 57 at Costello, and all hell breaks loose, and Anastasia gets murdered, and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But I'll ask you, Genovese and Costello were at one point friends. Am I right?
You know, in the film, The Alto Nights, it says that they're best friends. I didn't really see it. I didn't see any evidence of that. I mean, and I think when you talk about friends, it's not like you and your buddy, go out and have a beer or go to a baseball game together, or sitting around talking about your, who's the best shortstop, or what's the best, book you read last week. They weren't like that. So, I think that they were in the same business, and they in a way, they sort of worked for the same guy when they worked for Luciano. But I think that, there's this sort of conceit in a lot of books about the mafia, and I might have fallen prey to it a hair myself, is that, like in The Godfather, there are the good mobsters and the bad mobsters, right? So when you think about the stories like, Costello is the good mobster and Genovese is the bad mobster, and that ignores the larger picture, which is that they were both pretty bad.
Yeah.
And they had a terribly corrosive effect on America. I mean, your idea that Genovese, had he not, sort of participated in that murder, history would have been changed. I think that's true. But you also have to realize that given his character and his history of screwing up in a way, he might have done something else that would have got him.
Yeah, if it wasn't that one, it would have been somebody else.
I think so to some extent. Yeah, but he was very clever. He wasn't just this stupid, violent guy, because he goes over to Italy, right? You mentioned he goes over to Italy, and he's he's basically starts to provide cocaine to Mussolini's son.
Yeah,
and he gives supposedly $200,000 contribution to Mussolini under the table. And so
he's right up to him.
Right. So he's cozy with Mussolini. Then America comes in and, liberates Italy. And he works as a translator for the American forces. And they don't sort of, they couldn't Google him, so they didn't really know who this translator was. And then he, of course, at the same time he's working for the American government, he has this black market business going on where, because it's wartime and Italians can't get this thing. So he's like stealing stuff and selling it in the black market. So, that takes a tremendous amount of cunning rather, and versatility and sort of, real criminal instincts. And then of course he gets caught and he tries to bribe, the story, right? He tries to bribe the young man who's arresting him. And he says to him, you have to understand, it doesn't matter. Just take this money. No one will know. And none of what we do really matters, And so that was his sort of profoundly sort of the pure cynicism of his view of the world. There's no right or wrong here. Don't be naive,
he didn't realize, that the person he was, and I forget the guy's name.
Yeah, so do I.
Was a real do-gooder who you could have offered him any amount of money and he would not have taken it.
Well, if you're very corrupt, you can't understand someone who isn't. Because I can remember I sort of got to know these two guys who were basically loan sharks, but they were they weren't in the mob, they were mob related. And I had, a couple of meals with them, and I would like reach for my wallet, and they just laugh at me, because I had a job. What kind of an idiot gets up and goes to work every day? Your money's no good here.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I noticed about them, which might be of interest, is that they would never wait online in a restaurant, because they had to be special. So their whole mindset was the rules don't apply to us. So they would go
Yeah.
to the head table, they would like pay off the maitre d', we get taken to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is that they talked about food a tremendous amount, but it's another story.
Yeah, so I talked with Xavier Ebele a couple of months ago about his father, and he would say that he said they would go to the Copa, and his
Right.
father would go to go to. It's just like you see in Goodfellas. He would
Yeah.
go straight through the kitchen, straight through to his table. They never waited online,
Sure,
and
of course.
that was a pretty common practice, and not just a practice, and an expectation, to the point where when they had hired a new guy at the Copa who didn't know who Tommy
my
Ryan
God.
was, that guy ran into potentially a big problem when he said, "Hey, you can't come back here. What are you doing?" And he goes, "No, I can come back here." And he didn't realize he was pretty much talking to the de facto boss of the Copacabana at that
Right.
time, and
Well, that's
could
the
have been real
famous
bad.
that famous Steadicam shot where you just see what's that actress
Yeah.
name? Walking through. It's such
Leota.
a great
Yeah.
shot. Yeah, but I think Goodfellas is a great movie. But if you watch the first half of it, you just think, I'm going to join the mafia. This is like the greatest organization ever.
It's like an advertisement.
Yeah, I know. It's like sign up and go to the Ravenite and fill out an application. I'm going to become a member. I don't think I would have quite fit in though.
Yeah, not a lot of people. Not a lot of people who have been outside of the environment probably would fit in.
Yeah.
So Costello also, of
Yes.
course, had the relationship with Luciano, and I found it curious. And in making the Mob New York, you guys
Yeah.
kind of touched on it,
Uh,
where there's a meeting to decide who's going to be the boss when Lucky goes away, right? Is it going to be Vito, or is it going to be Frank? And Charlie pulls Frank aside because Frank, at least in the show, deserves it, right? He's the right guy for the job. But Charlie's like, you don't want that pressure. Let Vito take the pressure. And I guess one of my questions is, at that time, do you think that that's a scenario that was realistic, that Frank truly was the right guy for the job, but Lucky said, no, it's going to be Vito, so Vito can be the lightning rod?
I don't know if that scene was dramatic license or not. I imagine it was. So, I don't know. I mean, I would think that Genovese was the more hardcore. He was the scarier guy.
Oh, he
So
was a
maybe-
gangster.
and he was more willing to. You have to realize that everything that happens is enforced by either actual violence or or unspoken threat of violence. So even when Frank Costello, who was this sort of more diplomatic guy, said to a politician to do this, he didn't have to say, or
Or else.
because it was implied. It was implied. If you got a phone call and it was Frank Costello, it's got to be a scary thing. So, and I think that probably Vito was a scarier guy, and so and then probably I would think that perhaps Luciano saw, but you don't want to have an angry Vito Genovese. You don't want to take the top spot and have an angry Vito Genovese there, sort of simmering.
That would have been like Anastasia in Mangano.
Right, and that's
Potentially.
that's what happened later because of the circumstances you described of Vito going away.
Yeah. So Vito goes away,
Yeah.
and Frank becomes the boss, and he, for the next 20 years in New York, really is again, there were a lot of really effective bosses. Tommy Galliano, Joe Bonanno. Like, don't get me wrong, they were incredibly effective bosses for their time. But I think you could probably make an argument that Frank at that time was the guy, the number one guy from about 1935 until the Kefauver hearings in the early 50s. So I guess, talk about when he steps into the boss's chair and really ascends at that point and becomes the number one guy.
Well, I think that his goal was to be influential, to be politically influential, to use his influence in politics to, protect his interests, the interests of the businesses that they were in. And he wanted to grow those businesses, which is gambling, loan sharking, probably drug dealing. There was probably drug dealing going on within Genevieve's crime family, though he denied it. And
Vito's whole crew were drug dealers. Even the one, they were all drug dealers.
And in East Harlem, that's where the drugs are coming in. And so he wanted to use his political influence to protect those criminal enterprises, and he wanted to keep the peace between, rival gangsters, and he did. Everybody was getting a taste. People were getting, so there's really no reason to have the sort of violence that had taken place, which brought Luciano to power. And he was in that sense the prime minister. He was diplomatic, and he was very successful at it.
And in the 1940s, can't remember exactly what year, there's a wiretap that catches him saying to a guy named Thomas Aurelio, who was a politician, became for a short time a New York State Supreme Court justice.
Right.
Go ahead.
He was a magistrate judge, and he wanted a promotion. LaGuardia wouldn't give it to him. He wanted to be in the Supreme Court, and so he knew who to go to, and he went to Costello, and Costello's phone was bugged, and Costello got him, and he calls Costello to thank him when he gets the nomination, which means that he was going to win the judgeship. And Costello says, "When I tell you something's in the bag, it's in the bag." And then Aurelio says, says how grateful he goes, and my loyalty to you is never ending, something along those lines. And then that gets leaked to the newspapers by Frank Hogan, and it's front page news. Right, the Second World War is going on, but this is on the front page of the New York Times. And Aurelio and all the Tammany Hall people said, I thought Frank Costello was just a businessman, and Aurelio said, I had no idea what he was doing, which is, complete nonsense, really. But
everybody knew, but they didn't.
Right. And so then there's a hearing, right? There's a hearing to decide what to do with Aurelio. I think it was a disbarment hearing. I don't quite remember. And so Costello gets told to testify, and he testifies. And when he testifies, he starts to brag about all the important people he knows, because he loved to testify. He loved to talk about how legitimate he was, and it always ends up biting him on the rear end. And Aurelio sent it to the court anyway, and served for a number of years, and was apparently quite a good judge.
And the interesting thing is all of this time, Costello's in reality a mafia boss.
Yes,
he's not a good guy, as you said.
Right.
But he wants so badly to not be anything other than he is. He wants so badly to fit in with his upper world friends. He is the early inspiration for Tony Soprano. He goes to see a shrink to try to help him out with this.
Right.
And his shrink tells him maybe you should disassociate yourself with these people.
Right.
But he can't, because it's all that he knows. It's what he knows. But he wants so badly to be anything other than Frank Costello, mafia boss, to the point, and I forget the name of the organization, and I'm sure you're going to remind me. He does a fundraising
For Salvation
benefit
Army. Yeah.
for the,
Yeah.
yes, the Salvation Army,
Yeah.
and he thinks that's going to go well
Yeah.
for him,
Yeah.
but it does just the opposite because of what people know about him now that he's the boss, he's the Godfather. He's also one of the early sources of inspiration for Vito Corleone, who is an amalgamation. And I think you had sent me an article
Yeah.
about the Godfather right before we jumped on. And
Yeah.
Vito Corleone is an amalgamation of he's not just Frank Costello, but
Right.
he's a few other bosses as well. But there are some Costello-like traits,
Right. Well,
right? All the judges in the
right.
yeah. Go ahead.
The idea that he has all the judges, and the idea that he has an olive oil business as a sort of a cover, as the Profaci family had that,
Right.
and
Yep.
and then this sort of rhetoric about men of honor and all that. That's from what's his name?
Bonanno.
Bonanno. Yeah,
Bonanno.
and his book
Yeah.
is full of that sort of stuff. And so, I think so. That's what they artfully combined all the qualities of those bosses. But the thing about the fundraiser at the Copa, right? He provided he was
Yeah.
he basically owned and ran the Copa.
Yeah, he owned it. Yeah.
Right, and he gave that to the Salvation Army to have this fundraiser, and there were judges, there were congressmen, there were socialites there. Hoffman, his psychiatrist, also was in attendance. Who, and I put this in the novel, which I thought was just so entertaining, is that he had been F. Scott Fitzgerald's psychologist, and so yeah, they're all there. They all show up, so it wasn't a disaster. It raised a great deal of money, but then, of course, the headlines were Frank Costello, and then Salvation Army. So we had no idea who he was. We just thought he was a businessman, and they're going to give the money back, et cetera. But it was just just another, really, perhaps the first very public humiliation for him. And so he's trying to do these things, and they inevitably backfire. And to get to my original point, that's because he didn't really understand how society was working. And it's sort of you sort of feel for the guy. He's trying to do something that's impossible because he needed the criminal enterprise because that's where his power was, that's where the money came from, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, he doesn't become what he becomes without the threat of violence behind what he's doing. And as he's trying to become this respectable, legitimate figure, like you said, things are backfiring, and anybody that gets close and gets caught getting close immediately has to back away from him, which renders him at a certain point persona non grata, right? So Aurelio, even after being recorded saying that, had to distance himself.
Yeah.
You've got, at that time, the mayor was, I believe, after LaGuardia, O'Dwyer. And
Right.
O'Dwyer is at a party, and Frank Costello's there, and they're in the same room. They're not supposed to be in the same room. And O'Dwyer's asked about it, and he kind of has to distance himself.
Well,
so
yeah.
it's an interesting dynamic for
Well,
sure.
I think what was alleged was, O'Dwyer was the Brooklyn district attorney, and he was very successful in putting away Murder Inc. people, and that's how he built his reputation. He was the guy who also had Abe Relis, who was going to testify.
I want to get to that guy.
Yeah, and so that didn't end well for Abe Relis. But he had been in the military in the Second World War, and supposedly when he wanted to run for mayor, he allegedly had to go to O'Dwyer's apartment to this party where all these sort of Tammany Hall power players were there, and essentially kissed the ring. It was like going to Mar-a-Lago is today, in a sense.
Right.
Not to suggest that, anyway, not to overstate the parallel.
Right.
But and so he had to go kiss the ring, and then he had to try to explain that away to people, and And then he got deeply implicated in the Kiev overhearings as well.
Oh, he did. He did. So I want to go back to Murder Inc. and Abe Relis.
Yes.
And I always find the mafia genre especially interesting. In these days, you've got all the informants are doing YouTube shows, which is it's really hard to fathom. And I can imagine that if some of these older guys knew how this thing would play out, they would just roll in their grave, turn over in their graves. But back, in the 60s, you have Joe Valachi, and a lot of people assume that that's where it started. That's the first big informant that ever said there was a mafia, there was something, there was an organization. And the reality is that's just not true. It's not accurate. There's lots of paperwork that if you take any time to research, you would know that there was a plethora of informants giving information well before Valachi. And one of the biggest people, biggest informants in history is Abe Relis,
Right.
who, he's significant, not just because of who he was as a major hitman for Murder Inc. and a major mobster in his own right. But he's really one of the biggest guys in that early age to come out, and he sent people to the electric chair. Joe Valachi didn't send anybody to the electric chair. Abe Relis sent multiple people to the electric chair based on his testimony.
Right.
And so he's a very significant informant that gave up and nearly put a guy like Albert Anastasia in the electric chair, who was running his organization.
Yeah, I think he would have if he hadn't. Well, I mean, that was the idea. But
right.
What's interesting, I mean, your point is well taken. But even Lucky Luciano
gave information.
Gave information. He turned in the whereabouts of some of heroin when he was a kid, when he was a young man. And there's a wonderful book called The Mob in the City by Alex Hortis, and he dispels the myth that there were no rats, back in the old days, and he does it by you just keep turning. He lists them all the mobsters who had flipped, and then you turn the page and there's some more, and then you turn the page and there's some more. So that it's a myth that this idea of omerta is a myth. I mean, no one had done it as spectacularly as Valachi, but apparently what Valachi and Relis had in common is an incredible memory. This sort of amazing memory.
Or a supplied memory by the people coaching them up.
Yeah. That I'm sure that point is well taken. But and they were probably quite good at testifying. But the idea of omerta is really sort of greatly exaggerated.
And the question that I was getting to was, people don't associate Frank Costello with violence. But you cannot be the head of a major mafia family in the 30s and 40s without, maybe not personally, but without ordering people to die. Right. And Abe Relis is the best example, because Albert Anastasia at that time was a major and was for a long time a major ally of Costello. Even though Anastasia hated his own boss and eventually murdered his own boss, he was an ally of Costello, which is why they nearly went together kind of in the 50s. And so to protect Anastasia, who was running Murder Inc., Relis had to go. And he did go. He was the canary that could sing but not fly. And I guess the question is, it had to be Costello that ordered that and made it happen. Do you think that that's true?
I think there's so many things.
He had the police. The police probably did it.
There are so many things that are unknowable, and you just have to, if you get interested in this stuff, you have to learn to live with it. I was very young when John Kennedy was killed, and you can't go down the rabbit hole. So you just have to live with the fact that you're never going to know the real story on the Kennedy assassination. You're never going to know the real story on who ordered the hit on Relis, or if indeed he was trying to escape, as the cops said. Yeah, I think it's just one of those things you have to classify as unknowable. And it's not like the Harvard History Department is looking into this stuff, And then because so it hasn't been a subject of real serious scholarship. And the other problem is that anyone who knew the real story is a criminal, and they lie a lot, right? So
Yeah.
no one's going to tell you the real story. And they love these myths, these gangsters. They love these myths that, make them seem more powerful and more sinister than they, all knowing than they really are. So they would go for any sort of conspiracy theory, whether it's true or not, because it would inflate their view of the power of the mafia and their own power. It's being omnipresent. So it's sort of as though they're these sort of underworld superheroes, who can
Yeah.
manipulate history in a way, which they really weren't. But the idea is immensely appealing to people, to filmmakers, to film audiences, to readers, etc.
So, and that may be true, and we won't ever know,
No.
especially because, well, all the people that would be in the know to tell that story are gone. They were
Yeah.
liars anyways.
Yeah.
There's no forensics that can be
No.
repulled. Like they're actually, from what I understand, they're actually currently looking at the Sam Giancana murder, and
Oh, really?
somebody in Chicago has done a forensic investigation and is supposed to be releasing in the next couple of days.
Oh,
And
really?
it will be released. It will be released before this comes out. Who really did it? But there's not going to be that with Abe Relis. But I think the premise still stands that Costello was the boss from about 35 to 57. I believe that there's no plausible way that you can be a boss of the Genovese family and not have had somebody killed at some point.
Or it certainly
And people
happened.
never talk about that.
It probably happened with his tacit approval. I don't think. I think
Yeah.
you're correct. I don't think it could have happened if he had,
Yeah.
if he didn't, if he didn't approve it. I would think, but they had, for their own self-interest. It was what was the phrase they used? He needed killing.
He did need to, yeah. Well, yeah, for those guys, yeah.
Yeah.
So I want
Because
to
he had the
ask you.
goods on Bugsy Siegel as well, So
Yeah,
he
he
was considered a
did.
guy. He was
Siegel
gonna
was
go to
also being held at that
L.A.
time.
Yeah.
So 1951, the Kefauver hearings, and you've got I believe they call it the ballet of Costello's hands, or the ballet of the tapping fingers, the hands, something of that nature, where they only
Yeah.
show his hands.
Yeah.
And that was a choice that he made along with his lawyer,
Yeah.
and that choice majorly backfired on him. And I guess why do you think that is?
Well, there's this new medium, which they didn't understand, and they didn't want the public to see his face sort of squirming under the lights. So they thought, well, they requested, like, as soon as the hearing starts, George Wolfe, his lawyer, stands up and says, "We're not going to let you show his face." So they just focused on the hands. Of course, he was, nervous as hell, and he was rolling up pieces of paper, and he was sort of going like this, and sort of like Pontius Pilate the whole time. And so it ended up being worse in a way, There is film of him doing it, because they were filming it for newsreels. So you could actually see him testify, but the people watching television at that time, that they didn't see that. They didn't see
Yeah,
that. They just
which made it appear more sinister.
right. So it was called the hand ballet, and it
Even
was
though he's just fidgeting like any normal person would do.
yes, exactly. But and it's funny. It's like if you're in a business meeting sometimes and you're bored, and if you just look at people's hands, they're incredibly revealing what they're doing with their hands, because they don't think about it. They can have one expression on their face, but they're fidgeting with their hands. You see if they're bored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that was not a good decision. But the whole decision to testify was problematic.
It was a bad call. And he was one of the only ones that tried to stand up and justify
Yeah.
and go. And again, I think you nailed it, pretty well. It was a miscalculation because I think he thought that he was smarter than he was, and I think he thought morally that there was nothing wrong with who he was, and that was the miscalculation. And I think in addition to getting publicly embarrassed, I think he embarrassed himself and damaged his standing significantly within the family
Oh, yeah. Weakened
and
him. Yeah.
weakened him. And he goes to jail. And of course, who's back? Who's back in the United States to swoop in and take advantage and stir dissension? But Vito Genovese. And so Vito, of course, in the early 50s, knocks off and makes the case to knock off Willie Moretti, starts plotting behind the scenes, and eventually gets Carlo Gambino on his side, who is now sitting directly under Albert Anastasia, because by this point Anastasia has knocked off his boss Vincent Mangano, which Costello supported. He supported when that came in front of the commission. And so Vito's working behind the scenes, and by 1957, Frank is vulnerable. So for most people, I think by this point know the story. If you're not familiar with the story, well, I think it's I forget the month, but it's spring or early summer of 57, and Frank's coming from dinner, going to his apartment. I believe it's Central Park West.
Yeah.
Walks in, and a gunman who turns out to be a very large Vincent Gigante, future boss of that same family, comes in behind him, levies a gun, says, "This is for you, Frank," fires, and somehow misses, but injures Costello, but somehow misses. Gigante runs out, speeds away, and is eventually brought to trial. And Costello sticks to the code, doesn't implicate him, and as Costello's walking out of court, Gigante goes, "Thanks, Frank," right? Like it's a sign of understanding.
Yeah.
And then in October of that year, about 4 or 5 months later, Gambino, if you believe it was Gambino, and Genovese, they make the move on Anastasia, and Anastasia is killed. And then comes Appalachian.
Right. Right.
They have the Appalachian meeting. And
let me just say something about
Let's stop there.
Yeah, let me say something about that hit, which is sort of interesting. Costello was coming from dinner. So who was he having dinner with? He was having dinner with a New York City gossip columnist and a guy who ran a modeling agency. So these were sort of legitimate people, and he just walks in. He doesn't have bodyguards. He just walks into the lobby of this wonderful apartment at the Majestic in Manhattan, and he gets shot, and then he goes to the hospital. And the cops are interrogating him, and he has $2,000 in his sport coat, which they steal, right? So the cops ripped him off, and then but what they also find most damagingly is a slip of paper which has the winnings from one of the hotels in Vegas that they control, and actually the guy who was with him, I think it was the guy who. One of his friends who had been at that dinner party hears the shots, and he comes back, and he says to Frank, "Is there anything you want me to hold for you?" But Costello had just been shot. He didn't have the presence of mind to give him the slip of paper, because when you get shot in the head, it's like really confusing. So so that's sort of it. But it's an interesting. But so it was literally, you could see him in the course of an hour or two going from one world to another, and that's sort of the story of his life. And another interesting fact about that is that later on, his lawyer goes to a dinner party at Frank Costello's house, and who was among the guests but Vincent the Chimp Gigante? Because, no hard feelings, it's,
Right.
yes, you tried to shoot me or to kill me, but, come on over and,
You're just doing your job.
we'll just let
You're
bygones
following
be,
orders.
we'll just let bygones be bygones. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Appalachian happens.
Yes.
Everybody knows it's a fiasco.
Yes.
It is put right at the feet of Vito Genovese because he called for it in the same location that they had the meeting the previous year at Joe Barbara's estate in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets raided. It's a big giant embarrassment. A lot of people are pulled in. Huge embarrassment, and it puts the mob, which had been starting to be center stage, it puts them on Front Street.
Yeah.
And now everybody knows who they are and what they do. Names are named, and it's really hard for J. Edgar Hoover to go any farther without admitting the existence of this underworld organization that controls most industries in the United States by this point, especially in every major city.
Well,
And,
they controlled the industries they controlled, right? They didn't control General Motors, right? They didn't control the Ford, right? Yeah,
but they controlled the unions that made those companies run.
Point taken. But they didn't. They exploited smaller, vulnerable organizations. They didn't sort of go for a major American organization, but their power was extensive.
Extensive. And so Vito has major egg on his face after that moment, and Vito becomes the one that loses power because, after Frank is shot, he essentially gives up the position, and it's Vito's, and Vito's now the boss, and it becomes the Genovese crime family. And a couple of years later, 1959, Vito gets convicted of peddling narcotics, which he, throughout his career, again, we've said it, he was a drug dealer. His whole crew was drug dealers. But in the case in 1959, the evidence would suggest that Vito was framed. And I do believe that in that case he was framed. It's the right guy for the wrong crime, kind of like Luciano. And
I think Luciano was guilty of prostitution, but go ahead.
Well, we'll agree to disagree. I think he partook. I don't know if he was. Yeah, let's.
Okay.
That's a lot to unpack. I don't want to get into that discussion today. There's a lot of meat on that bone.
Right.
But a lot of people believe that Carlo Gambino turns on Vito.
Yeah.
Possibly Luciano and Lansky, who are not on good terms with Vito.
Right.
And maybe even Frank Costello. Because the other guy that gets swept up in that bust and goes to prison is Vincent Gigante. And he goes for a short stretch as well. Vito gets sentenced to about 15 years. And he goes down to Atlanta to do his time, which is invariably what actually ends up, leading to the Valachi turn. But Vito dies in prison. So I guess one of my last questions about Costello is, do you think that he was part of that setup?
Again, it's just one of these unknowable things. I don't know. I mean, it's conceivable. I don't think it'll ever be known.
Okay. I'm gonna take the stance that I don't know either. I think it's plausible that any or all of those guys could have gotten together. I definitely think he was set up. I just don't know who did it. But Costello, after this point, he is supposed to be, he's essentially shelved, right? But he's not. He's not an active member of the family for the golden years of his life, but he is people do go to him from time to time
Right.
for advice, and he kind of lives out his life. He works in his garden. Again, that's probably inspiration for The Godfather, with Frank winning gardening awards as he goes into old age, and he's essentially retired. And for a mobster, um, usually they say there's really two possible outcomes. It's either you go to prison or you're murdered.
Mm,
And it's very rare, I feel like, or it's rare for people in the position that Frank was in to get out in a clean way. And
mm.
aside from getting shot in the head, Frank dies in his own bed
Right.
at old age in
He
the
did.
early 70s.
He did need to spend some time in the Atlanta federal prison
A little bit, yeah,
before
but
that.
not
Yeah.
like it's not like he died in prison, is I
No.
guess what I mean.
No. No. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, um, he wasn't exiled like Luciano. He
No.
didn't die in prison like Costello. He wasn't shot. Well, he was shot, but he wasn't. He sort of dodged that bullet, and so he did better than many of his contemporaries.
Yeah. Yeah, about as well as you can do. So what I guess the last question, then I want to ask about Alto Nights, and then we'll get you out of here.
Okay.
Is what do you feel like Frank's ultimate legacy is in terms of his involvement with Cosa Nostra?
Well, I guess his legacy is that he was effective, and what his life really proved was you can't live in two worlds. You know, you really can't. So
Yeah.
he tried, but he couldn't do it. But when you consider where he was born and what he accomplished, it's impressive. And not to justify his career, but all the things that he was most associated with are legal now. So it was, the
Yeah.
Italian lottery. Well, this lottery now. I could. This conversation could be over. I could go online. I could bet on any sporting event in America as it's happening. Um, I could go to the corner here in the city and I could buy legal marijuana.
Yeah.
So a lot of and obviously I can go get a drink, and so all these things that he provided for people, many of them are legal now. Of course, heroin isn't legal, but. Oh, and the other thing is, juice loans, which the mob did, so playing these horrible figs, and if you didn't pay up, you got
Yeah.
beaten or whatever. Well, what kind of interest do the credit card companies get from you now? I mean,
Yeah.
so
Especially these days.
I don't, not to justify anything he did, but it is interesting to look back and see that many of the enterprises he was associated with were illegal, but didn't really need to be. And as society evolved, they weren't illegal. Do you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
what did Capone say? I'm just giving the people what they want.
Public service. Yeah.
It was hardly that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
prostitution is legal in some places as well, So
Yeah. And, if you're looking at it in terms of his level of quality as a boss, I think he had peaks and valleys, especially when you compare him to other bosses of that time frame or bosses that came afterwards. I think the farther you get out, although he had his peaks and valleys, I think it's fair to say that Frank, again, I'm not trying to glorify these guys. They're bad guys. They're just our bad guys, and they did bad things. But when you compare him objectively, he turns out to have been one of the better bosses in the history of Cosa Nostra in terms of his ability. He ran the biggest family in the country for a solid 20 years before he finally fell off the horse.
Yeah.
And most people think he was pretty effective at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So So let's move on to Alto Nights. So I just checked, and I'm gonna admit I have not yet seen this. My life has been a whirlwind over the since the movie's been out
Yeah.
for a number of reasons. And when I do get time to watch a movie,
Hmm.
I'm not allowed to watch because my kids won't let me. It's always what the kids want. Whatever they want to watch is what we watch. So
I'm sure that's
I
better
never
for
am
you.
able to sneak away to watch my gangster movie, no matter how much I want.
Uh-huh.
But Alto Nights, released March 21st of this year, it is getting a 39% score on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
So critics are not liking this movie. So I'll just ask you: have you been able to spend any time and to watch it?
Yeah, I did watch it. I went to an empty theater as soon as it opened. I was eager to see. I mean, the great Robert De Niro,
Yeah,
what he would do in this role, and of course, in the film he plays Vito and he plays Frank. So you have to respect De Niro's career. I mean, this is a guy who's like one of the great actors ever. Nick Pileggi wrote, you know, the the book that Casino is based on,
yeah,
and Goodfellas, and so you have to have an enormous amount of respect for him. So those two really created among the handful of most successful mob films ever. So you feel it seems incredibly ungenerous to say anything negative about them. That said, the film, it's not a success. Barry Levinson, who directed it, has directed some wonderful films, some really, from Tin Man to Wag the Dog. I mean, these are fantastically good movies. But here, it felt as though it was the genre itself was tired, and it wasn't the moment to make this film as great a story it was. And it tries to tell a very large story and to stuff almost all the incidents we discussed today into one film. And so
yeah,
probably it didn't quite work. And it was a little disconcerting to see De Niro playing both roles. Although, as an actor, I think he could do anything, but
yeah.
that might have been even beyond even his grasp. Not that he wasn't convincing in each role. It was just that you keep watching and think, "Oh, how do they do that? How do they put them together?" Sitting at a table and talking to each other. And then there were some historical anomalies in it that would only bother someone like you or I.
Yeah.
The most egregious example really was they have Genovese allegedly killed the first husband of his second wife, and that actually happened before they were married, and in the film it's after they're married, and that's sort of like the timeline of that
Yeah.
sort of drove me crazy. And then in the depiction of Costello, he has a close relationship with his wife, who's of course quite beautiful because it's a film, and in real life she didn't look like a movie star. And there's no mention of the mistress across Central Park, which to me was sort
Yeah.
of, but Pileggi's the guy. Pileggi's, you wouldn't have this whole genre without Nick Pileggi, so you have to have a lot of respect for him as well.
Of course, yeah, and over the years, the likes of De Niro and Pesci and Pileggi and Scorsese, they've, Marlon Brando, Francis Ford Coppola, these guys have given us some truly amazing movies,
Yes,
which I'll watch anytime they're on. I will sit and watch them until the day that I die.
right, right. Well,
That being said,
yeah,
the genre these days is very, very tired, and
yeah,
quite frankly, I'm a believer that there hasn't been anything good since Boardwalk Empire came out. And Boardwalk Empire was fantastic. And the reason that I think that Boardwalk Empire was fantastic, because it was historical fiction as well. quite frankly, was because they pulled from a different pool of actors. Not that some of the actors that you see in the big mob movies didn't come in and play roles, but the primary actors weren't the common actors that you see, the De Niros, the Pescis. And I think Alto Nights could have worked 20 years ago with De Niro, because it's a tremendous challenge, in my opinion, to have one actor play two roles in the same movie. That's a fantastic concept, hard to pull off. And I think, watching The Irishman, I think one of the things that made it really, really hard was the CGI with the face. I don't know how much CGI was used here, but De Niro's age. There's no, even with CGI, there isn't a really good way to fake an 80-year-old man given a beating, because he's not moving as limberly as a 20 or 30-year-old man. And there's really no great way to fake that.
Yeah,
And that brings me kind of to my point. I love Robert De Niro. I love Joe Pesci. I love all these guys. But at some point, we got to pick different actors to carry this genre forward. What are people going to do when these actors and actresses ultimately pass away? Is there just going to be no more mob genre if you can't put Robert De Niro in the movie? Like, let's get some new blood into this genre and start casting new people. Like, this would have been a great movie because, and The Irishman too, because they interplayed with different age ranges to have young actors in and to mix De Niro in as older. And not only that, again, I love De Niro, but he's about 20 years older than both of these guys were when the events took place.
Right.
So,
But
come on.
You know what I loved about The Irishman? I mean, there were some wonderful scenes in that movie. And,
There are.
And I love the fact that when a new mobster appeared, it froze and you find out how he got killed.
Yes.
Because that way, Scorsese was really de-glamorizing this business.
Yes.
Like, he was telling you, this is the history, this is what happened, and they seem happy now, but this is how it ended.
And it was all the Philadelphia guys, which Philadelphia
and I
was
thought
mayhem.
that was a masterful shot. And then to show the aging De Niro is the aging gangster fidgeting with his pill box, organizing his pill. The pills.
Yeah.
Those are sort of wonderful moments in that fantastic scene.
There were.
That fantastic scene between Pacino and that British actor.
Stephen Graham.
Yeah.
Stephen Graham, who's fantastic, by the way. I love that guy.
So good. That great scene where he shows
Down in
up,
Miami and they're having their argument.
He shows up late and Pacino said, "That's what you wear to a meeting? That's what you wear to." I mean, that was as good as any scene in any Scorsese movie. And Graham was just brilliant. And then to find out he's playing this Italian gangster, and then you hear him talk and he's got this British accent. I mean, that was a brilliant performance. And Pesci was brilliant in that movie.
Pesci was brilliant.
Brilliant.
In that.
He never raised his voice. But you feel the power that he had.
That is true.
And I thought that was just, it was a genius performance.
I will give it that.
Because you expect histrionics from Joe Pesci, and this is such an example of how to succeed on film by bringing the audience to you. I thought that was great. I really thought that was great. So, I mean, I didn't really believe the whole thing that that he'd killed all the people that he claimed to, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But but movies, these movies, they're not obliged to be historically accurate.
No, it's all about
storytelling.
Good storytelling. A good story doesn't always have to be historically accurate. Although
my point about The Godfather is it's a fantastic film with the greatest cast ever assembled in Hollywood, maybe. But where's the money come from? You don't see them committing crimes.
Yeah. They romanticized it, but if you read the book The Godfather, you get more of that violence and more of where the money comes from. But no, they definitely had to cut some of that out to really make it operatic with The Godfather and truly create a good mafia versus the bad mafia guys
Right.
dynamic
Right.
in the movie. But I still contend it's the best movie ever made. And anytime I come across somebody that hasn't watched it, I'm very offended.
You know,
Like, come
no,
on.
well, obviously the acting was just so brilliant, and the cast was incredible, but also the costumes and the cars, everything was
Yeah,
perfect.
the
You know,
authenticity. Yeah,
it was just done with such authenticity, and it looked like it was shot years ago. And of course, Brando was, you know, amazing, amazing.
yeah.
You know, the first scene where he's got that.
The cat.
Yeah, Coppola, I read an interview. He said, "You don't really direct Marlon Brando. The only thing I did was like just cost him a kitten
Hand
before
him
the
the
scene
cat.
started."
The
That's
cat that came just hanging around the set. Yeah, I do. So
so great.
I've done a couple of the scenes on this podcast. It's only available on Patreon because you can't get it through the copyright filters in YouTube. So I've taken it down on YouTube and just put it
Uh-oh.
on Patreon. But I've done scene breakdowns of The Godfather. I haven't gotten all the way through the movie. I did the opening scene. We talked a lot about that. So it's a mix of what's happening in the movie, what's happening in the book, the historical stuff about the background of the actors, stuff about behind the scenes, and of course the cat and the appearance of the cat and where it came from and how that all came together in that first scene, which was incredibly brilliant. Yeah, just it was just a random cat hanging around on set that
And
he just
Pacino,
put
and
in
in that
Brando's
scene,
hands.
Pacino is like giving the whole backstory to Diane Keaton, which is it's just expository, which is not
Yeah,
supposed to be that interesting. But that's not supposed to be how films work, you know. But it does. It really does. Well,
it works.
he's
It works.
brilliant. He's really
Works in
brilliant
the
in it.
book. It works in the movie. Yeah,
Yeah, he's really
yeah.
brilliant. What a great actor.
Hard to believe they almost fired Pacino from that movie. The and a lot of people don't know this. One of the first scenes, if not the first scene shot, was the restaurant scene because they were gonna fire Pacino. They didn't think he was right
Yeah.
until they filmed that scene and they saw the cuts of that scene and they're like, okay, I think we can work with this. But he fully thought he was going to be fired. And so they moved that scene up to the beginning. And that's the first scene that gets shot,
Yeah.
which is crazy. Because it's in my opinion, it's the best movie in history. And that's the best scene in the best movie in history, the restaurant scene. So, all right. I think that's a great place to
Yeah.
leave
I
it
think you've
for
got. Yeah.
tonight.
Yeah.
Ron, thank you so much for coming on. Let me grab your book. Had it right here behind me the whole time. Everybody, again, if you want a really, really good and interesting read that kind of puts you in the mind of Frank Costello, I highly encourage you to go and get Frank Costello, a novel. You can get it right on Amazon. Yeah, go take a look at the book. And Ron, I'll kick it over to you for final remarks.
Thanks, Jacob. It was fun to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great discussion. As I've started ending every episode, we'll say goodbye, and I like to say, may your troubles be light, but your envelopes heavy. All right, bye everybody.